suck. I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. You can buy most of that shit that I make over at post-mort.com. Hope to see you there. Alright, let's take a look at Eberron Rising from the Last War. This is a supplement for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, and it's still not really a proper world book, but it is as close as you're probably going to get in the current iteration of D&D. It is a Magitech setting, somewhat like, at least under Western numbering, Final Fantasy VI. And I am a fan of Magitech settings, when they're explicitly Magitech settings, in the same way that Eberron is. I'm less fond of the way Magitech is being incorporated into more traditional fantasy settings, such as Faerun and so on. And with the philosophy that D&D now has of incorporating everything into everything, some of the uniqueness and specialness of Eberron, perhaps the one setting in which, for example, a combat wheelchair might make some sense, but not much sense, Eberron loses its specialness. I much more prefer Magitech science fantasy settings where there's more internal consistency, you might say, or where it makes more sense, or even, if such a thing can be said to exist, hard science fantasy. Hard Magitech, something more like the Iron Kingdoms RPG, where the ideas and the technology are much more developed, much more consistent, and much less just kind of hand-wavy. Anyway, so Eberron Rising from the Last War is really, at best, I would say, an update of the older material on Eberron. And the older material is going to give you far more information, far more of what you need. There's probably online Eberron wikis or something where you can get this information, and then you can view this more as a sort of update. And the older edition stuff tends to be available, at least in PDF form, on places like DriveThruRPG. You can pay for that, you can download it, you can then have it printed yourself somewhere like lulu.com, or when we're allowed out of our houses again, when it's safe to be out of our houses again, you can probably go to a print shop and get one or indeed several of the older books printed and bound, and the setting information there is still useful to you anyway. So this is more like a proper setting book in that there isn't really any specific adventure information in here, which is good because that would be a waste of space. And you've got over 300 pages of material. I still don't consider it to be a proper world book. As I say, it seems to be more updating the older material, but this is a new edition. It should really be standalone, but it is the closest thing that I think you get to a proper old-fashioned setting book in this set of new editions, though perhaps the new Ravenloft setting book, if it turns out not to be shit, fingers crossed, will be more akin to this than some of the other setting books that aren't really setting books that we've otherwise gotten so far. So the important thing to remember about Eberron is that there is a lot of magical technology, and it's somewhat ubiquitous, and much of this came about during a great war which exists in the setting's past and fulfills somewhat of the role that the First World War, to a lesser extent the Second World War, did in real history, in that it hangs heavy like a stain over absolutely everything else. Perhaps the most visible elements of that technology are things like the lightning trains, which travel across the more civilized and settled world in this, and one of the races, which are essentially robots. There are other additional new races in the game. Well, not new, I suppose, since Eberron came out originally for 3rd edition. but new in terms of the broader D&D. You've got different kinds of elves, because you always need multitudes of different kinds of elves for a setting. You have doppelgangers as a player race. Dwarves are somewhat different. You have all the usual standards, but then you get things like the doppelgangers. Civilized goblinoids, which I'm not particularly a fan of. I much prefer the Iron Kingdom's approach to those, if you have to have them. Kalashtar, who are sort of half spirit beings, is probably the easiest way to put it. You have other goblinoids, orcs and half orcs as playable. Shifters, which are sort of partial shapeshifters, and Warforged is the most obvious Magitech influence. I said earlier that of all the settings, this was the one where a combat wheelchair might make the most sense, in that it's Magitech, so there are magitechnological solutions to these issues. But you will find quite a few differently abled illustrations throughout the book. D&D rules, particularly 5th edition D&D rules, don't make sense when it comes to this. And in Eberron, even though like prosthetics or wheelchairs and so on make more sense in one way, they also make less sense in another way, since regeneration magic is available. Magitech cybernetic prosthesis is available, and the magic is much more available and ubiquitous than a lot of other settings. So there is no reason why this gnome with half an arm shouldn't have had a cleric regenerate the rest of that arm, or shouldn't have a Magitech cybernetic prosthesis there instead, or have spells that temporarily replace a limb with an invisible force, or an unseen servant effect tailored to that kind of thing. So that's a bit jarring. I mean, thematically it fits. There's also a sense of noir and it's sort of investigation and so on to a lot of the setting, alongside all the traditional fantasy elements. But it just doesn't hang together, which is generally the problem with crippling injuries in any kind of game setting that has regeneration magics or replacement technology and so on. Unless the character is poor, at least at the start, but then within a couple of adventures, typically you're going to have enough money to pay off the church to regenerate your arm, or, you know, in these settings, God does heal amputees, or gods heal amputees. Another element is the dragon mark, which is another level of customization and speciality for your characters. If I remember correctly, they handle that as a sort of racial subtype. They don't quite work. Yes, they do it by replacing subraces. So you might have an elf with a particular mark rather than one of the other elven subraces. So it doesn't quite work, it doesn't quite fit. It has been kind of crudely shoehorned in to 5th edition, which is a shame, because 5th edition does have a degree of character customization, nowhere near as good as 3rd edition or 3.5 edition in terms of character customization and in terms of skills and so on. Otherwise, it is a pretty good game for customization, in the way that you can play against or with type, and you've got your sub races and your subclasses and your backgrounds and so on, all of which increase your customization. But when it comes to adding dragon marks in Eberron, it just feels kind of a square peg into a round hole to try and make it work, to try and make it make sense. Got a new class in terms of the Artificer, which is great within the Eberron setting, and again, I'm a fan of Magitech and so on, but as it spreads to other areas of D&D, other worlds of D&D, Artificer, at least in terms of this interpretation, doesn't fit particularly well. And part of the problem that I think Eberron has is that it is meant to, in part, be a sort of pulp, film noir, sort of early adventure serial sort of world, but 5th edition is really largely unsuited to any of those genres of play, particularly. Like, you can't really replicate Conan, one of the pulp novels, with vanilla D&D 5th edition. You can't really create a particularly engaging noir detective story, or if you can, the rules aren't really working with you. You can't really create an adventure serial like The Shadow, or things like that, particularly with 5th edition, unless, weirdly, you pinched some of the ideas and rules from 4th edition and brought in like 1 hit point mooks for your crime fighting rogue or whatever to mow down in large numbers for reduced levels of experience. There is an increased readiness of magical healing in the setting, which takes even more sting out of being hurt or damaged while you're playing through your adventures and exploring the wilds and so on. There's even more reduced risk when it comes to Eberron, which, if the base rules were more violent, more harmful, more difficult, if healing was more scarce in the base game, then reducing that for Eberron, which is meant to be more pulpy and more survivable and more action heroic in a lot of ways, then that would work fine. But because D&D is, as 5th edition, is already heavily insulating characters from the consequences of their poor actions or poor die rolls, then it just feels excessive when it comes to Eberron. So I think if you do want to create more of that kind of narrative effect, narrative support for that kind of action adventure genre, what you should probably do is tone down your normal 5th edition healing and then use what was the normal amount of magical healing and so on in Eberron. As I pointed out, with the gnome, a lot of the depictions in this are at odds with the actual feel of the setting, with the actual implications of the setting, in that prosthesis, healing magic and so on is much more available. So why would there be differently abled, blind, crippled, limbless people in Eberron as a setting? I mean, after a great war, you probably would have a lot of crippled, blinded, and otherwise harmed people suffering from post-traumatic stress and so on. Mental illness is an arena in which there isn't really a lot of healing magic, probably reflecting a lack of understanding and engagement with mental illness in the history of D&D, and also the difficulty and disempowering nature of it for player characters. It's always a complaint about fear rules and mind control rules and so on, and they interfere with player and character agency. Mental illness do the same thing, but there's no magical school of psychiatry, for example, which might be an interesting thing to bring up. Spells that give you resistances to mind control effects or immunity to fear and so on. I mean, there's a few that have that as a sort of incidental side effect, but a healer who specialises in psychiatric healing might be a fun thing and would even fit Eberron quite nicely, I think. But when it comes to crippling injuries, being wheelchair bound or missing limbs and so on, in a world with such ubiquitous magic and so many different clerics and so on, so many options for magical prosthesis, regeneration spells, spells that remove conditions like incapacitated and so on, it just doesn't really work, and the depictions are at odds with the implications of the rules and the text, and that creates a disjunct which can throw you out of immersion in the game. Though I understand that a lot of people aren't necessarily looking for immersion anymore, but for me, immersion is the gold standard of a game. And to make immersion really work, you have to have the buy-in from the games master, you have to have the buy-in from the player, but the rules and the setting also need to synergize to make that work. So my gold tier standard for system and setting working in concert is Feng Shui, where the rules encourage you to do outlandish stunts and provide you bonuses for doing outlandish stunts and crazy things with your character, and thereby help create that kind of Hong Kong cinema, over-the-top martial arts and gunfighting action. In Eberron, however, the setting depicts something fairly grim in a lot of ways, no pun intended, dark in a lot of ways, but the rules simply do not support that. I mean, you're working with D&D, you can only customize it so far, but it throws me out every time when I consider Eberron, and that's helped me to shift and change my own ideas in running my Tabletopless campaign, which is also set in a Magitech world, but one that is more fantastical, where the magic is dialed up a bit and the technology down slightly depending where you are, but still. There's some interesting additions to rules. Rather than give scenarios, they've given you maps and suggestions for things that might be there. The odd locations, that's more of a toolkit, so that's good. There are rules that are found elsewhere as well. Ideas like group patrons for your adventuring party. Rules for that were also found in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. There's options here as well, so expanding on that. That's the kind of thing I like. I think sort of toolkit expanded options. There are group concepts, which helps you give an idea to hang your group together rather than being a wandering band of murder hobos taking on whatever mercenary work they might otherwise be able to find. So that's good. And the guild organizations give you plenty of adventure seeds, which is always my preference over completely set adventures. Because you can take an adventure seed as a games master and you can develop it from that initial idea, that spark, in a myriad of different ways. So you can be playing the same adventure seed with two different games masters and have two completely different games, or you can even use the same seed more than once as a singular games master for a group. And that role of providing inspiration works far better. We've got a bit on monsters and opponents and things that are more common in this world, like dinosaurs, a few unique monsters that you can easily take and adapt to your own game. Yeah, I did actually write some stuff for Eberron for the previous edition, 3rd edition. Stormreach I worked on. Because I was one of the few designers who'd actually played the D&D MMO, which was set in Stormreach. So that was interesting. Living spells are interesting, the monsters are interesting. You know, you need a few techno-magic monsters, which is it's a little bit scant from what I would have preferred here. But you know, the perennial things that you always need from a D&D book are monsters and magic items, and they've really got you covered there. Just would have preferred a few more sort of techno magic opponents, I think. And you get a removable map, which obviously I haven't removed. So this is more what I want to see from D&D, from setting books. It's still imperfect, it's still not really a proper world book, but with all the historical information you've got from previous editions, you can easily put something more detailed together. And again, there's probably online wikis you can use to supplement this, but this is still the closest thing I think you've really got to a proper world book out of 5th edition D&D. In terms of style, it's the usual workmanlike D&D style. They didn't really push the boat out and do anything particularly different, other than the newspapers, which don't look enough like newspapers to really work for me, I'm afraid. So it's a pretty bog standard for Wizards layout. and so I can't really give it anything more than the average, because it's the average of what you expect from D&D. I would have preferred a more evocative Technomagic layout, different choices of fonts and so on, and that they could have gone the extra mile with the newspapers to make them really look more like old real world newspapers. In terms of substance, however, this definitely goes over and above the other books that we have for D&D 5th edition. So in terms of substance, I'm going to give them a 4 out of 5. Still not quite there in terms of providing the same amount of useful information and detail and world atlas and so on as you get in the old Forgotten Realms guides, for example. So that's 7 out of 10, or 3.5 out of 5. For a 5th edition D&D supplement, this is above average, and probably one of the ones that is most worth getting. But if you just want to rip elements out of Eberron, you can probably make do with things like Xanathars, Tashas, and so on, and then use those as toolkits to create your own settings, your own monsters, and decide which classes and so on you want to allow in. But overall, good for Wizards of the Coast in this current edition and generation. Zang.
Satana Station is an addition to Machinations of the Space Princess. It's a whole sleazy space station, full of locations, services, adventures, and inspiration for your old school space opera games. Over 100 locations, a bevy of non-player characters, and more plot hooks than you can shake an Arcturan mega stick at. Buy it at post-mort.com, drive-through RPG, and hard copy at lulu.com.